Want to make this winter your most memorable one yet? Check out the Frozen Assets Festival happening at the Edgewater and on Frozen Lake Mendota from February 3rd through the 9th. On Saturday, February 8th, bring the family for a day of free activities and participate in the Frozen Assets 5K run/walk, the only 5K in North America that takes place entirely on a frozen lake. Funds raised support Clean Lakes Alliance's mission to protect our lakes. Head to cleanlakesalliance.org/frozen-assets to learn more and register now. Today on CityCast Madison. Madison's school district needs more teachers. Over 10% of Madison's teachers are working on what's called a one-year emergency license, meaning they are not yet fully certified to teach, and that number continues to rise. Emergency licenses are a stopgap to help fill vacant roles, but at what cost? What impact does lowering the standards of entry have on our schools? To learn more, we sat down with Cap Times education reporter Kayla Wynn, who recently reported a piece on the issue, and Mike Jones, president of Madison Teachers Inc. Teaching Union. It's Monday, February 3rd. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Hey there. Before we get into today's show, we've got something special for you. It's a pretty crazy time for the media right now, and for social media. Facebook's no longer doing fact-checking. Twitter is now X. AI seems to be taking over the internet. TikTok is back, but for how long? It's a wild ride, and some days it feels like there's no platform we can trust. But we're here to say nothing has changed about our mission here at CityCast Madison. We started this podcast and our Madison Minutes newsletter because we believe that local is where it's at. We want you to feel more connected to the city, not less. We're not here to add fuel to the polarizing battles that dominate national media. We're here to talk about this place where we all live and to explore with empathy and curiosity the issues that matter in our city and in our communities. And we want to do it with you. If you want to make sure we can keep this local conversation going, we'd love to have you as a CityCast Madison member. Our work is only possible through your support. We'll even give you a tote bag for it. We've got 15 CityCast Madison tote bags left to give away to the first 15 people who sign up today. These are the final few totes we've got, and we won't be ordering more like them. So hurry to snag one of the last few by becoming a member at membership.citycast.fm. Be sure to include your mailing address at checkout so we can send you Lucky 15 your tote bag. Please note, totes will be mailed out within 2 weeks. Hi, Kayla. Welcome back to the pod.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Yes. And hi, Mike. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Yes. So we're going to dive right in. Mike, we often hear about how we need more teachers and how there's a national shortage. What's the current staffing situation in Madison Metropolitan School District? Does MMSD have enough teachers?
The short answer is no. And the longer answer is we've never had enough teachers because schools have always been publicly underfunded for decades. So a lot of this is kind of chickens coming home to roost.
Well, Kayla, we have you on. You put out a recent article where you talked about how there's been an uptick in teachers on emergency licenses. So that's a big thing we want to talk about. First off, what are emergency licenses and how many teachers are on them here?
An emergency license is issued by the State Department of Public Instruction, and it basically allows people with bachelor's degrees in any subject, doesn't have to be education. It allows them to teach in schools without yet fully meeting the requirements for a whole license. And so what I found in my reporting is that there are about 300 teachers in the Madison School District who are working on those licenses. So that's about 10% of the entire teacher workforce.
And these licenses aren't new, right? It's just that we've seen a steady growth in them.
If I could chime in, because I actually started as an emergency licensed teacher in Milwaukee in 2009. So it's been a long-standing practice, especially in urban districts around areas of special education, ESL, and in certain districts, math and sciences.
Mm-hmm. I do want to kind of understand the evolution of how that we're at this higher number where we're at today, because we know that many states eased their licensing standards over the pandemic. So, Kayla, can you share anything about how that number of emergency licensed teachers has changed over the years?
Yeah. So, what we know from the Wisconsin Policy Forum, they researched this and found that the number of emergency teaching licenses in Wisconsin has tripled. And that was from 2012 to 2022. We don't have more recent data. And so it has grown. And they suggest that it is because schools are having a hard time hiring people, and they're also struggling with turnover.
Well, Mike, I'm glad that we have you, considering that you literally have the experience of having gone through that process. And, the big question that we're posing today is is there a concern that we are lowering the standards for teachers to get more people hired? Can you touch on that, Mike?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's significant concern, especially within the union amongst educators, because lowering the standards is also a way of deprofessionalizing the act of education. So the more we get to this standard of any adult with a pulse and no criminal record can do this job, I think lessens the emphasis or what it actually takes to do any of these jobs in education. And honestly, that's been a long-standing cultural aspect in our society for years. I mean, the phrase, those who can't do teach, kind of reinforces this idea that anyone could do this job. So I think paired with that, plus a constant underfunding, disrespect of educators and those who work in the education field, has led to significantly more burnout and more turnover, but especially in certain areas like special education and ESL and certain ones where there's an even heavier work burden than in comparison to other educators.
So teachers who have these emergency licenses are being pushed towards the places that need more specialization.
Exactly. And I think what happens also in practice is, especially over the last few years since we've come back from the pandemic, is special ed teachers are pulled out a lot of times from classrooms to substitute in other classes. So this teacher shortage or this worker shortage leads to a lot of unfilled teacher positions. But if you have a third grade class and there's no sub coming and there's no teacher, and you have a fourth grade class with a regular ed teacher and a special ed teacher, a lot of principals have been forced to pull that special ed teacher to sub in the third grade. And what happens is two things. One, not everyone can teach the third grade. There are different skill sets for each grade. And the second thing is that the students that the special ed teacher was supposed to work in fourth grade now aren't getting the special ed services they're supposed to be getting. So what happened? It's a double whammy. And mind you, all the work that the special ed teacher is supposed to be doing, now that they're not able to do it, they now have to do it after school or before school or on the weekends. So the more you're adding to that workload doesn't go away. The more you burn out everyone. And that's even just the veteran teachers who are also oftentimes trying to cover for the emergency licensed teacher or the new teacher because they don't want them to burn out. So they'll take more of the workload proportionally in order to help them and mentor them and support them. But that's a lot of labor that often goes unrecognized or unpaid.
That's definitely a hidden cost where it's just we'll let them in the door, but they need support, and they need support from other teachers who also have their hands full already.
Yeah, so it doesn't become just an issue of recruitment, but also an issue of retention. So the school district and a lot of entities have usually been able to hire well, but then keeping them in the district or keeping them in the profession is really the trick. And a lot of that isn't just money, but working conditions and respect in general. How do you feel whether or not you're effective in your role?
Yeah. And I would definitely want us to talk more about retention in a bit, but I am curious about this question, just in terms of lowering standards. Certainly we're hearing from you, Mike, what you're hearing from other teachers. Kayla, I know that you quoted folks about the sort of consequences. What did you hear in terms of that question?
It was a little complex. So some educators said, this is a good thing. We're helping aspiring teachers get in the classroom quicker. They don't need to finish their education in the college classroom. They can actually just go right into schools and get that training there. And they've also said, a lot of these emergency licensed teachers, they do have experience in other subjects, maybe not the one that they're using the emergency license for. So there is nuance there, but there are real concerns that a lot of the emergency licensed teachers are in special ed and bilingual classrooms. And people have pointed out these are often the students who need some of the most support, who need the most help. And if you don't have that sort of specialized training, it can be difficult to know exactly how to teach them. So that's a big thing that I found. But I did speak with a teacher after I did this reporting who told me I was hired on an emergency license as a bilingual resource teacher, and I did not even speak another language. I only spoke English and still do. So I think that there are some worries there, again, about these teachers. They might be good educators, but not necessarily trained in the subject that they're teaching in.
You're reporting on this issue. I'm curious, are there parents in the district that you've spoken to in terms of, are folks concerned about this? Obviously, where you're flagging an issue, Mike, you're experiencing and you're hearing about it from teachers. Like, how about parents?
I think there is concern for parents who have students who are in special education classes. In particular, I heard from one parent who likened this to being a doctor. You wouldn't want to see a doctor who didn't go to medical school. And that's her own personal opinion. Again, I think that there probably are many educators on these licenses who are really good at their jobs. So it's complex and there are many moving parts. But yes, some parents are worried.
Mm-hmm. Mike, have you heard from any?
Oh, absolutely. I think I've heard from not only special educators, but their parents that they're trying to serve. And the kids is that no one's particularly happy with the system in terms of how it's funded or prioritized. And I think often special education students are kind of given, are made second-class citizens in the schools and in the place, or it's considered such a negative that sometimes parents don't even want to engage with special education services because they feel like they'll be underserved or under-supported. I would say, as someone, like I said, who had to go through an emergency licensing process, there's a lot of pressure to perform. And sometimes the only way you get better is to try and make mistakes and learn and grow in your craft. And fortunately, I had people in my corner who could help me with that. And not every emergency licensed person has that, so that they can learn and reflect and grow from their mistakes and work with parents or caregivers on ways to best serve their kid. And usually because we don't have that sort of system in place, or there's no time or effort or energy into that, that's where kids get underserved.
Well, yeah, and I want to hear a little bit more about your experience, because if I'm understanding this correctly, teachers who go on the emergency licenses, they're actually spending time trying to get their license while they're teaching. So not only are you going into a situation where you might not already have the skills or the mindset for that particular coursework, but you also have to develop it and hit these sort of goalposts. What was that process like for you?
For me, and this was, again, 15, 16 years ago, I had to do 2 4-hour classes per week after school. So I would work as an emergency licensed teacher. Then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I would go to another campus from 5 to 9 p.m. to learn the ins and outs of education, or, especially around special education, or just general DPI requirements. And I think it's kind of like having a job and then also doing grad school on the side. And so it's a huge, not only just time burden, but an emotional burden. Like I was in my first year of marriage, a lot of people, they tend to burn out because this impacts the relationships that they're in or lack thereof because they become disconnected the more work they have to put in. And that's where, again, it leads to a lot of burnout, not only for them, but also for the veteran special education teachers who are mentoring them and are trying to do more in order to kind of fill in the cracks or make up for whatever mistakes or shortcomings the emergency license person's coming in. Because I can also speak that I made my share of mistakes, and I had veterans who were looking over my paperwork, looking over my practices, and helping me and taking extra time in order to make me a better teacher. But that's extra work on their part, right? And they have families and experiences too that they need to do outside of just their job. So I think it's something that it impacts one area, but it stresses everything else in the system. And that doesn't even include the other stressors that are going on in an underfunded public education system.
Right. It is a pressure cooker.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking about staffing shortages in MMSD and emergency licenses that teachers are getting to fill in the gaps with Kayla Wynn, education reporter for the Cap Times, and Mike Jones, president of Madison Teachers, Inc., teaching union. We're going to continue our conversation right after a quick break.
Girl, you have got to try this Laneige lip mask. Trust me, my lips needed that love. Love these vanilla vibes from Kayali. That top note is just so smooth. Smooth and stunning. That's what you get with this K18 hair mask.
Those brands everybody's talking about, they're at Sephora. Discover the hype with the hottest names in beauty, including Laneige, Kayali, K18, and Rare Beauty. Click or tap the banner to discover the next big thing. Only at Sephora.
All right, we're coming back. Mike, I'm really curious, how can emergency licensed teachers be supported to be successful? Obviously, they're filling a gap, so something's got to be done.
Well, I think there needs to be changes in the workplace environment in terms of there are things that don't require money, but they do require time. So additional time on professional development opportunities so that they can kind of get focused. Having mentors who are specifically special education focused. A lot of times emergency licensed teachers might be paired with a mentor who is a veteran in education, but not exactly in special education. I've heard that from special education and bilingual resource teachers. So having those mentors and honestly taking things off their plate because there's a million things to do. So if you're expected to do the work of 3 people as an emergency licensed person, something's got to give. So being able to take off some of these hoops or that educators have to jump through so they can focus on the day-to-day work. That's what I hear a lot from new educators, whether emergency or even if they went through a traditional program in their first couple of years, they really need that time and that space to learn and grow. If it's just a constant pressure cooker and you don't have any time to do that, that's why many educators don't last. But then, of course, financially financing that and making that a significant priority. Like Dr. Jill Underly, the superintendent of Department of Public Instruction, recently, a couple months ago, submitted a budget proposal in terms of addressing some of these gaps. I think those are sort of things we have to deal with systemically when it comes to supporting our youngest and our greenest educators.
So, Kayla, in your reporting, did you get any information about what types of candidates are typically applying to teach on emergency licenses? Who's filling these spots?
So I did not receive a demographic breakdown of who these people are, but in other states, we do know that emergency licenses do attract more candidates of color, and that might be in part the fact that the tests to become a licensed teacher are expensive. And as Mike has said, there are barriers sometimes to licensure. So some people argue when you're getting emergency license, it helps diversify the teacher workforce.
Yeah, I was curious about the positives. The positives. There's obviously a ton of challenges, as we've heard laid out. But what were folks telling you about what is good and what benefits can come from having this still be a part of the teacher workforce, the emergency licenses?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think one group of folks who sometimes come up through the ranks are special education assistants who become licensed special ed teachers. So they actually do have special ed experience. They might just not have finished their college degree or done the actual licensure. I know many who've gone that path, and I think life experience is huge. I would say I used to be a writer before I was a teacher. I know teachers who used to be social workers, who had construction jobs, who did a whole bunch of things. So they're being able to bring in that real world experience outside of education is really helpful to not only connect with students, but also to connect with educators on this is how the world outside of the four walls of education work and how that goes. So it kind of expands our scope and our worldview, which I think is beneficial for everyone, not just the kids, but for the workers as well.
Another one that I forgot to mention is that people who move to Wisconsin, so they could be from a different state and be licensed there, they can use an emergency license in Wisconsin. So they'll eventually get their state teaching license. They're already licensed in a different state, but once they come here, it allows them to do it too.
Yeah, that's huge. And we love a diversified workforce, certainly. But as you mentioned, Mike, the system needs to be supported. If you're going to be doing this, there's truly a need for support and the sort of people power. So it's like it's fixing one issue, but it's offering others, which is something that has to be considered. I think if we could turn to talk about the root cause, we mentioned it already, but retention and turnover, why we're in this situation in the first place. Do we know, firstly, Kayla, any information about turnover in emergency licensed teachers? Like, is there a revolving door there at all because it is more challenging for them?
We don't have any research into Wisconsin, but in other states, we have seen that people who are on emergency licenses were not as effective in improving student test scores than their peers who are traditionally licensed. And in some cases, the turnover rate was higher.
Well, I saw a recent press release from MMSD that comparing data for last year's 2024 to 25 school year, so through December 31st, to that of the year prior, 2023 to 2024, turnover has declined among several key employee groups, including teachers, down from 12% to 7%, and supportive education employees down from 13% to 5%. So, Mike, what do you think is happening in terms of teachers sticking around? A few of them, it's like, it's a small change, but significant in some ways.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's helpful is that we eventually, through the referendum that our community graciously voted for, overwhelmingly was able to provide the cost of living adjustment. Because there are educators also who have left the profession over the last 15 years because they could no longer afford it. They couldn't afford to live in Madison. They couldn't afford their cost of living. The Wisconsin Policy Forum estimates your average teacher has lost about $100,000 in buying power over the last 15 years because of Act 10 and other restrictive policies. So I think that definitely has helped, but I think there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of supporting teacher autonomy and staff autonomy and chances to grow as opposed to have everything prescribed to you. I know when I was an emergency teacher, I was given a curriculum that was like, you have to say this at this time and do this at this time. And I wasn't getting any growth from my students. And then when I deviated from that curriculum, my students increased their reading levels by 2 grades because I had the freedom to actually make some adjustments and do some things that were good for the kids, not good for the program or the system. And I think we sometimes put too much of an emphasis on the system or on the program because we pay millions of dollars for it. And we worry through multi-billion-dollar standardized testing industries on what makes a student successful as opposed to actually knowing the student and building a relationship with them to see what success means to them and helping them meet their metrics as opposed to us trying to push our own metrics on them, which are usually based in white supremacy and bias and all sorts of systemic inequities that we inevitably perpetuate if we just focus on test scores.
Mm-hmm. And of course, teachers are in the profession to teach and to teach effectively. So the level of frustration to be prescribed to something that you can see is not working, I can't even imagine. And we're talking about turnover and retention. Job satisfaction has to be a part of that. I do want to note, talking about Act 10, in December, Dane County Circuit Judge Jacob Frost struck down the majority of Act 10. That is currently on hold, that ruling, and it's expected to go to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Mike, if Act 10 is struck down by the court and collective bargaining for public sector employees is restored, what do you think that could mean for the district's ability to retain teachers?
I think it's a win-win if and when that happens, because what happens is it becomes an honest conversation on what collective bargaining agreement pre-Act 10 was not just about wages. It was about all parts of your working condition, and even the ones that employees didn't particularly like or concessions. At least there was an honest conversation about it, and it felt like there was some back and forth. But when you move to more of a top-down, this is what the boss says and this is law, it leads to a lot of resentment, not just in education, but in most forms of employment. And I think what it would be able to do is people would actually feel more ownership of being a part of the system, of being an educator, instead of having things dictated to them and losing autonomy. That's something that doesn't translate well for job satisfaction. And that turns up in how we teach the kids, because kids can see through disingenuous teaching and disingenuous adults. But if adults are truly passionate and truly believe in what they're teaching and how they're teaching it and how they're working with kids, students respond to authenticity. We know that. So I think it would benefit everyone involved to have more honest conversations as opposed to hiding behind legal walls and titles and who's the boss and my words goes, because that leads to disengagement and more dissatisfaction. That's why we still have these gaps.
Well, we're obviously going to be paying attention to what happens with Act 10. We appreciate you guys so much for coming on. Mike, Kayla, thank you for getting us up to speed about what's happening with staffing shortages at MMSD.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
That's Mike Jones, president of Madison Teachers Inc. Teaching Union, and Kayla Wynn, Cap Times education reporter. If you want to go read Kayla's reported story on the emergency licenses, head to our show notes for a link. That's all for today, here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, your host. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with a teacher or a parent in the district? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care.